Today's episode is brought to you by Malwarebytes Premium. Protect your computers and devices from cyber attacks 24/7 with Malwarebytes Premium. And go to malwarebytes.com/lock-and-code for an exclusive offer. That's malwarebytes.com/lock-and-code.
The public has just had to sort of speculate, and I guess law enforcement as well, has had to speculate about what a backdoor in a tech product would actually look like. Well, here's the answer. This is literally what happens when there is a backdoor, and I find it crazy that not more people are paying attention to it, just because here's the answer. You can go look at it.
This is Lock and Code, a Malwarebytes podcast. I'm your host, David Reese. Our main story today is about the largest law enforcement sting operation ever. That's the description given by reporter and 404 Media co-founder Joseph Cox, who this week is publishing his investigative book on the years-long campaign by the FBI to capture the private communications of underground criminals. This is the story of Anom, the company behind an allegedly secure phone that promised users a bevy of secretive technological features, like end-to-end encrypted messaging, remote data wiping, secure storage vaults, and even voice scrambling. And while some of these features, especially end-to-end encrypted messaging, have today become popular for everyday consumers, the features packaged into Anom phones were built specifically to attract criminals. And that's because Anom was not a secure phone company at all. Anom was a front operated by the FBI. For decades, the FBI, the U.S. Department of Justice, and law enforcement agencies around the world have tried to obtain a backdoor into criminal conversations. That effort has sometimes splashed into public view, like when the FBI demanded that Apple unlock an iPhone used in a terrorist attack in 2015, a demand that Apple fought, alleging that such an effort would create a backdoor not just for one iPhone, but all iPhones. But this story isn't about that. It may touch on some of the same issues, the legal arguments, the privacy implications, but it involves a much smoother and quieter path to what the FBI likely considers an enormous success. This story is about how the FBI simply bought a backdoor into an emerging phone company for just $120,000 plus $60,000 for the founder's moving expenses so that it could operate all the machinery from behind the scenes. On Anom phones, every message, every threat, every photo, and that includes those of cocaine hidden within crates of welding equipment, and every dick pic, odd but real, yes, and every order to kill someone was collected and delivered in full view to the FBI. And it went like this for years. Today, to help us understand the true story of the secure phone company Anom, we're speaking again with Joseph Cox, author of Dark Wire, which releases this week, and host of the 404 Media podcast. Joseph, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming back. Thank you for sending the book. I am reading it as it is still happening. Don't ruin the ending for me. You can't ruin the ending for me. I know what happens, but it's kind of fun to say it that way. There is a ton to get into, so let's just jump into it, right? There was a lot, even at the intro, that I kind of have to be vague about in describing it because, one, the story is insane, and two, the details are insane. And so I want to jump in really broadly here. How did Anom, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, it's Anom, how did Anom work on the government side? What was happening?
Yes, you are pronouncing it correctly, although some in the US government say Anom as well, and then I get very confused in my head, and then I switch between pronunciations. But let's go with your one, because I'm pretty sure that's correct. As for how it happened, there was this company called Phantom Secure at first, and this sold encrypted phones to organized criminals, very, very popular, including with the Sinaloa drug cartel and biker gangs in Australia and all sorts of other criminal enterprises. The FBI shut down that company in 2018. It tried to get a backdoor into it, but for various reasons that was unsuccessful. They arrest the CEO, Vincent Ramos. They eventually prosecute him. He goes to prison for a long time. But the company is dead and it's shut down. The criminals who were using that suddenly don't have a communication lifeline to one another. When you're in organized crime, time is money, perhaps more than any other occupation, illicit or otherwise, I can really think of. So these people really need to get in touch again quickly. In the wake of that, in this vacuum left by Phantom Secure, people realized in this industry who sold encrypted phones to criminals that they could be next. They realized, oh, the FBI is not messing around. So one person in that space who uses the handle AFGOO, AFGOO, they made an extraordinary offer to the FBI. And they said, in exchange for, a lowered sentence or not prosecuting me, something along those lines, would you like this embryonic encrypted phone company that I've been making on the side called Anom? And you can go and use it in your own investigations. Maybe you can even put a backdoor into it as well. And I can't stress enough what an amazing proposition that is to law enforcement. I mean, you were mentioning Signal and WhatsApp, and I'm sure law enforcement will love more access to those tools, or the San Bernardino case where they got into the locked iPhone eventually, right, by using offensive hacking tools. Now imagine that, but on a worldwide grand scale, if Anom could grow to that size anyway. And that was the proposition given to these agents, and they leapt at the chance. I was told that the Australian officials involved, they looked like Christmas morning when they first learned that this was actually going to happen.
So I think you touched on something really great there just at the end. The Australian officials, like you said, that was that wonderful image, right? That was like Christmas, Why is Australia engaged in this? And more so, I'm trying to ask here, who is involved in Anom? Is it just the FBI? Is it not even the FBI at first? Is it like a smaller agent's office somewhere in the US? How does it grow to where it is? So again, who's involved? Why are they involved?
The Australian Federal Police is involved, and that's for a couple of reasons. The first is that these encrypted phones, and especially Phantom Secure before Anom, they were incredibly popular inside Australia specifically, and that would be the Cremacheros, which is a very violent biker gang. You had Hells Angels there as well. You had offshoots of the Italian mafia in Australia, money laundering, drug trafficking, all of that sort of thing. And they used those phones, and it really stymied the authorities there. I think one official told me that it was basically a scourge on the country. Very strong language, but it absolutely did cause a problem. As for how the AFP get involved, this operation from the start is really a close collaboration between the AFP and specifically the San Diego FBI, which is the field office of the FBI, which took down Phantom Secure. And during that earlier operation, they developed various relationships with multiple Australian agencies. So when AFGOO comes forward and this opportunity presents itself, it's basically presented to the AFP and to the FBI at the same time. And they go through this episode where they're figuring out whether the backdoor would actually work, how to do it, and AFGOO develops this backdoor with some coders, some of which I actually spoke to, and they prove that this can work, and the AFP verifies it, and then they start this, essentially a beta test in Australia. And when you hear beta test, you may be like, oh, we're just going to roll out our software to a small number of users. And I guess they did that, but in this case, it meant we're going to give the phones or let the phones land in the hands of a small number of criminals to verify the backdoor works.
So what could the FBI and the AFP see? We talk about a lot that this is a backdoor. Does that mean they can see only messages? Does it mean they can see things that are stored on the actual phones, like locally? What could these governments see?
So it starts with just the text messages, as in, it's basically like a Jabber client and server that people may be used to when you take Jabber and then you add OTR encryption to it. I remember doing that back in the day. And fundamentally, it's basically that. So it starts with text messaging, but then that ramps up when Anom itself starts to introduce more and more features. So then there's, sending videos, there's sending audio, there's scrambled voice messages which add like a distortion to your voice. So if it's ever intercepted, at least in the eyes of the users, whoever intercepts it wouldn't be able to get their voice. There's then stuff like a secure vault where you can store, addresses and bank account details and all of that sort of thing. And apparently the GPS of the phone is also entirely turned off. The thing is, that was all a lie, basically. So you have all of those security features advertised to the Anom users, and they think this is great. This is like a really sexy phone in the world of encrypted devices because we've never really seen anything with this many features. And then the FBI had basically puppet mastered it. So there was an image redaction tool which would blur out people's faces. Well, the FBI just got a copy of the unredacted image. The voice scrambling one, it was set up in such a way that the FBI could reverse it in some cases and get the original audio. And the secure vault was, I think I just call it like a paper fort in the book, because that just all gets transmitted to the authorities as well. So to answer your question, it starts with text, but then it's basically everything I just described you could do on the phone. And it turns out the GPS is actually secretly enabled as well. It's
just the entire thing's a sham. It's like, oh, okay. Yep. That is, if I was a criminal, I would be extremely scared upon learning all this. But I'm getting ahead here. I also wanted to know, because the type of access that the FBI and the FP have here is to a lot. As you said, there's photos, there's voices, there's messages that can get scrambled, there's, this paper fort of a secure vault. That to me feels like they are then getting a sort of fire hose of activity of crime. And so I wanted to know, were there crimes that, government agents simply said, look, we just got to look the other way? One, we got to look the other way because of prioritization. We just don't have enough people to address all of these crimes happening at the same time. And two, we have to look the other way because we're running the show and we can't reveal that we're running the show. And so my question again is, what crimes were passed over, both because of prioritization, but also so that the FBI doesn't blow its cover?
Yeah, that is a constant tension throughout the book, in that the FBI and its eventual partners later want to collect all of this intelligence, but if they move too loudly or aggressively or swiftly on it, it's going to become obvious that the phone is backdoored. So they played God, essentially, in what crimes were allowed to be committed and those that weren't. For the crimes that they would allow, it seemed to be mostly smaller drug shipments, or even some fairly large drug shipments as well. But I don't think this is actually in the book, and I don't think I've told anybody about this yet, but there's actually a part of the surveillance system, and there's a setting that they can click and enable to sort of mark the chat after they've listened to it. And there's pertinent, which means it's relevant to crime, non-pertinent, so it's not. And then I think there's one that just says cannabis, it has its own setting. So clearly, that I found that very, very interesting, because I don't think anyone actually confirmed this to me. I'm not sure if it came up in my conversations with the FBI, but cannabis was hard-coded into the surveillance tool, which would very strongly suggest that, well, this is cannabis, we don't need to worry about it. And I think that makes total sense, right? With the move globally to, decriminalization or legalization of that particular drug. So they would have let shipments of that go, but then meanwhile, they're seizing or acting upon these massive multi-ton cocaine shipments that they absolutely can't let go through.
This idea here that you started with, that they played God, right? With what crimes were permitted and which weren't. Just a fun thing, just a fun thing to think about in terms of like, that's how intelligence agencies operate, I think, in the day-to-day, not even with this. But that's, I'm revealing a bit about how much I feel about particularly U.S. intelligence. Moving forward, I also wanted to talk about how all of this sounds a lot to me like entrapment. Essentially, the government is putting phones into the hands of criminals and then waiting for them to do crime. And I'm wondering, like, okay, how is that getting approved? And the broader question here is, how is the entire project getting approved? Because it sounds unreal almost. So how did Anom get clearance to even operate? What was that origin story like?
I think that's one of the crucial things, is that this operation was run and in part approved by outsiders, essentially. One of the main characters of the book and of part of this story is a prosecutor called Andrew Young. He, started with tax law and white collar crime, like that's sort of that world. And then he finds his way almost by accident in the world of gambling and then drug trafficking. And then that leads to the Phantom Secure case, and then that continues. But when the idea of Anom comes up, that's very vital because he has not been bogged down with the same way the drug prosecutions have worked in the United States for decades at this point, right? Which is especially with San Diego at the border, that is handing out pre-written plea agreements to underprivileged people crossing the border to smuggle drugs for like a few $1,000s or something like that, like incredibly low-hanging fruit. And my impression was, talking to the prosecutors involved, they just didn't care about that. They wanted to do something that they thought was a bit more impactful. So he's an outsider, so he's driving the operation at the start and is the legal architect, essentially, of it. You then have another outsider who is Bob Brewer, and he was a Trump appointee at the time, the most senior law enforcement attorney in the Southern District of California, I think. And he was also an outsider in that usually people in that position rose through the ranks, but here being a political appointee, he was basically roped in, right? Mm-hmm. And he's very old. That's just a fact of it. He was 70-something, I think, at the time. And he didn't have to worry about a job after this, so he just wanted to approve it as well because he thought it was the right thing to do. Now, absolutely, individual listeners or people can absolutely disagree with whether they think this was the right thing or not, but that's what these people thought. They genuinely thought they were doing the right thing by approving this backdoor, and I don't think it would have happened if it was like done at Maine DOJ in DC or the Southern District of New York or something like that.
Yeah, it's wild to understand that something of this size and this impact can be implemented because of what I could only call like this startup mentality, right? I grew up in California. I spent time working in Silicon Valley proper. And so to me, I'm just like, oh, this is just like a ragtag group of folks who are like, let's shoot for the moon. And then it gets approved. And it's insane to me that worked in the federal government. We have this image that it is the antithesis of, the startup mentality. I wanted to ask also, were there individuals who pushed back on Anom, who said, this is too risky, or even just, this is dumb, this isn't going to get us anywhere? Who pushed back, if anyone?
Yeah, so there was a lot of pushback at various different levels. The first layer would be when Andrew Young was trying to get that first layer of approval that Bob Brewer eventually did, but the other drug prosecutors around this large conference table, as I describe in the book, and I've been in this building, I've walked through the place where this all happened, and the drug prosecutors around that table were like, no, this is a bad idea, you can't do this is not how it's done. They got through that layer, and then there were many more meetings in DC, in some cases which Andrew Young was sort of iced out of, and he had to get on a plane and sit outside the door so they would let him back in. There was a lot of friction there. And then jumping forward a little bit, but I won't ruin it entirely, there was basically another part of the DOJ basically killed an element of the operation. There is something called the Office of Enforcement Operations, I think it is, the OEO, and they approve every federal wiretap in the United States. If you want a wiretap, they have to approve it, basically. And they never did that for an Anom phone, meaning that no phones in America were monitored, or at least were not monitored by the Americans. They were monitored by the Australians in sort of a loophole, a workaround, something you could call it like that.
Just knowing that this is how surveillance works. It's like, yep, that is how it works. Were there any changes that were demanded to the program before it was implemented? So, we heard a lot of pushback, and you said, like, right here, right, OEO never actually approved wiretaps for phones in the hands of Americans. Were there specific demands that said, okay, we'll do this, but only if X? I'm just trying to see, was the pushback conditional?
Yeah, there were like two main trade-offs. The first was with the American phones, we don't want you looking at devices in the US, or rather, we'll figure that out later because that's like a very complicated legal question. So they set up this thing where the FBI would actually, in a technological sense, never receive messages from Anom phones that were inside the US. There was sort of this relay race where the data would be taken from the phones, it would go to a server to a third country that the FBI would never name, but I found was Lithuania, and I published that. And then Lithuania would provide that data to the FBI. But the way it was set up, all the US phones were stripped of that. So there's that first bit, that sort of technological trade-off. The second one is that the agents, or rather the people in control of the operation, basically promised and said that, well, we're going to be really, really strict on monitoring of threat to life, which is where somebody sends, obviously, a threat across the platform. That could be an image of a weapon. It could be a very direct threat of, I'm going to come kill you at this address. And they promised that they would intervene in as many of those as they could. And they did. They say that they intervened in something like 150 threats to life. But as I found, that was not always successful. And at least one person did die due to an assassination plot that was planned on the FBI's own tech startup.
Gosh, I want so badly to get into that story, right? And we will. We have time to do it. But I also want to move a little bit to the business, right? Like Anom is a company, and I don't mean to unduly criticize the FBI here. I would criticize every government agency in this way, not because of like scorn, but because of like they're not adept or they're not qualified, I think, to run companies. That's fine. That's totally cool. I don't blame the post office for not making money. They're not supposed to. So it's totally fine. But again, the FBI feels like one of many agencies which would be entirely unqualified to run a quote unquote secure phone startup. So how did they do it then, right? And what I'm particularly interested in is how did the FBI make Anom appear legitimate, right? We were talking about a lot of features that things were getting added. Anom has to be popular to criminals, which means it has to be like it has to run as a business. So how did the FBI make Anom, again, appear legitimate?
Yeah, I mean, you're right in that the FBI does not know how to run a tech company. It also does not know how to run a tech company for serious organized crime either. But they figured it out. And the key thing is that because they shut down Phantom Secure, they basically had a blueprint, or rather like a template of what one of these companies looks like. They weren't just looking from the outside. They infiltrated that company with informants and a lot of investigative resources. And they found that you need a lot of things. Well, you need very reliable infrastructure, and Anom had that. It used, high-speed servers spread all over the world. It had unlimited data SIMs. I think they actually used eSIMs, so it was very easy for customers to quickly get more coverage if they were going to a different country, and that's a very, very nice feature. But I think the really key thing for popularity was that the FBI itself didn't actually sell the phones, and that's good for a legal reason, because it means that people can't really go, well, you entrapped me because you sold me this device or whatever, because technically the FBI didn't do that. What they did was they let Anom spread organically through the criminal underground, because that's how these companies work. They have these sort of decentralized networks of resellers who go face to face and they meet criminals and they sell them the phones. You know, a 6-month subscription can be hundreds, if not thousands of dollars. They do that. They take the money. It filters back up the chain to their superiors, who may then give it to Afgu, again, the creator of Anom, or someone else. And then, of course, eventually, some of that money does go to the FBI as well, who reinvests it, I'll say, back into the company. So from the outside looking in, Anom looked and operated just like any other encrypted phone company. It had customer support. They had to fend off hackers. It had sort of viral marketing techniques where you could only access the website if you knew a password. It sort of reminded me of Google Plus back in the days when that was trying to take off and you had to know a friend to get onto the platform. They marketed it well, but not just that. The criminals unknowingly working for the FBI did a very good job of marketing it as well.
The criminal side of it, it's giving phones to criminals, and the criminals just start spreading it both to conduct their own crime, right? Like they have their own drug trafficking rings. And so they're like, well, you got to use this phone. That's how I operate now. But I'm more curious about the people, just the coders, you know, the sysadmin of Anom. Did they have any idea? I just feel like, how siloed does a company have to be for you to create what you believe is an encrypted messaging app, and then on the other side of the wall actually know like what you made is a facade? Were there regular everyday engineers at this company, and did they have any idea of what was going on?
Yeah, so I've spoken to multiple people who worked inside Anom, and they basically had no idea what they were actually creating or what they were actually working on. One of the developers was just like an ordinary Android app dev from an Asian country, I think I say in the book. And, you know, would just log on, would do his work fixing bugs, and would log off and live his life, basically. He did know about the backdoor, or not under those terms. It was more a message archiving feature or a message sort of copying feature. And the way they understood it was that, well, they've told us Anom is being sold to corporations and they need to keep a copy of the messages for compliance reasons or something like that. Of course, that wasn't the case. The FBI was copying messages for their own purposes, but that's what they were told. And when it later came out that the FBI had been behind this the entire time, I was pretty shocked by how one of the developers reacted. He said like he wasn't bothered by it. If anything, he became proud of what he'd been involved with. He's actually even like told some people as well. But then someone else who also unknowingly worked for the FBI essentially felt exceptionally misled, and they felt like a pawn that had just been sort of cast away, and now they have to worry about, do organized criminals think I was part of this? Like, am I in danger? And I haven't seen any evidence of that issue sort of crossing over into real world violence or threats, but I can absolutely understand the concern that you've been working for this company for X number of years. It turns out the FBI was using it to spy on some of the most significant organized criminals in the world, like multi-billion-dollar drug empires. Doesn't look good for you when you're involved.
Was there ever a concern within the FBI that Anom would get too big? Like, what if it became, like, they wouldn't let it happen, right? But what if it truly took off in terms of like, it's comparable with an iPhone, or just a Motorola, like an HTC, like an Android developer? Was there, the surveillance just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Was there ever a concern you felt that when you reported that you picked up on that, like it's getting too big? I was always curious about that.
Yes. They were definitely concerned about it, and for that reason they did put guardrails in place. Like, they had a system where if a phone landed in a country that they didn't want to spy on for whatever reason, or maybe it lands in the hands of somebody that they figure out they shouldn't be monitoring for maybe legal or ethical reasons, they could turn that off and they could just add the phones to a block list. There was also something of a bottleneck on the production of these phones at first, was that they were flashed by a company in Hong Kong that used these little black box custom computers to then put the Anom software onto the Android devices. And that created like this, as I said, bottleneck where, well, they can't make too many devices at once, so it's not going to get out of control. But as I show in the book, there's various reasons why I think Anom started to grow out of control. And I'm sure the FBI would push back against that somewhat, but from all the evidence I've collected, there was something like they created a web portal where resellers could log in and they could set up the Anom phones themselves, taking control of that away from AFGU. Some of the top tier drug traffickers actually wanted to take over the company, and what they ended up doing was cloning those black boxes, and then they could just make the phones as they pleased. And then that's when production ramped up massively. And then also with the shutdown of Sky, which is another encrypted phone company, which was deliberately orchestrated by the European and American officials, an absolute tsunami of users migrated to Anom. And one agent said it was like starting all over again. It like tripled in size. And it got to the point where one of the agents at the head of the operation, Nicholas Chevron, told co-workers I spoke to that he kept saying that it's going to break. It's getting too big. It's just getting far too large to control. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what this person said. So it absolutely did start to get out of control. And I think that should give sort of anyone pause. I think it should give, business leaders pause. That what happens if your company grows too quickly? Not always a good problem to have. But I think it also should give law enforcement themselves, policymakers, members of civil society pause to show that, yes, I don't know if the surveillance technology here totally got out of control, but it was absolutely showing signs that it could do. Like, it got close.
I wanted to go back to something you said at the top of that answer, right? That there were controls put in place, there were guardrails, particularly for things like what if a phone was turned on and it belonged to a person that shouldn't be monitored, right? These agencies shouldn't be monitoring the owner of this device. That, I think, segues really well into a huge question that I don't know if there's an answer for. Was this legal? It sounds like it wasn't to me when I hear so many things, but it's such a weird question because there's a lot of workarounds. I'm particularly thinking of, like you said, the FBI couldn't receive messages directly from Anom. Like, they had to use this third country. And I do think it's funny that in the book, you preface it by saying, like, there's this third country. They absolutely did not want to be named. By the way, it was Lithuania. It's just a sort of workaround, a loophole, and that's why I think the question is kind of odd, is like, even if it wasn't legal, these agencies found ways to make it legal. And so the question is, was this legal? And if it wasn't, what did the FBI do to make it legal?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right in that they made it legal, essentially. And this will get tested in the courts. There are some cases ongoing about the admissibility of the messages in court as evidence. That's going to vary from country to country. And there's also a case in the US ongoing concerning the people who sold the phones were then later charged by the US, and there's, all sorts of legal questions over that. But basically, the long and the short of it is that if you're on American soil or you're an American, you have certain protections, like, you can't be wiretapped without a court order. You can't have your devices or your property searched without a warrant, hopefully, due to the Fourth Amendment. Those protections do not extend to anybody out of the US system, off US soil, wherever that may be. So yes, although the FBI could not monitor the messages of people inside the US, or rather they could if they got the wiretap orders, but that's a lot of work, and as I mentioned, DOJ never approved those. Anybody outside the US is basically fair game. And the way that was set up was that, yes, the devices would send their messages to Lithuania. Lithuania would then do a little bit of technical magic to remove any messages that were related to phones in the US. And then Lithuania would provide them this massive cache of data every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday to the FBI under what is called a mutual legal assistance treaty, like an MLAT. And this is basically a request between two different countries where it's like, please, could you give us that data? And that's essentially it. And it arrives with no strings attached, so the FBI can go through that as much as they want. And Yes, some civilians in rare cases ended up getting Anom phones. Yes, there were some lawyers on there as well, which makes complete sense because they're going to be talking to their criminal or allegedly criminal clients, right? And the FBI say that they try to monitor those phones to a lesser extent, all of that sort of thing. But the fact is that they found this very complicated legal and technical architecture that made this legal. Whereas it wouldn't be if you just set up a server in San Diego and started collecting data. It was like a massive task, both in a technological sense and like a legal one as well, to allow them to even do this.
You mentioned that Lithuania was sending this like cache of messages on a schedule every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And in the book, there's quite a few scenes about how agents have to get through essentially that day's shipment of messages, and the messages, there are more and more as time goes on. I just wanted to comment on that really quickly, that there's like this really fun moment in the book of what I would say is the FBI learning about what I would call like content moderation at scale. You know, it's like this problem that the internet has not solved yet. You know, major platforms have not solved like how to go through millions, if not billions of pieces of content at scale. AI gets it wrong. Humans shouldn't be subjected to seeing violent images as part of their day job. And here, like, the FBI is recreating that they just have to go through messages by hand to see, like, which crimes to prioritize, which to let go, which to click the box for cannabis, if that's real. And I just think it's a wild moment in the book. It's a wild moment of, oh my gosh, the FBI is learning the lessons of the internet in very real time. And that is, I hope it's humbling for the FBI, but I also think it's just kind of scary that is the problem. The problem is scale.
I mean, I totally agree. And I would only add that it became clear that they needed technology in some way to help with that, which I think also pulls into that content moderation analogy because, of course, Facebook and Instagram, Meta, whoever, increasingly use, if not AI, at least automated systems, right, in some sort of way for their own moderation. The Dutch authorities, who have done lots of encrypted phone investigations, they developed artificial intelligence programs that would surface conversations such as, oh, these two drug traffickers are talking about cocaine, so the analyst could go, oh, that's probably worth reading, and I'll look into it. And, you know, I just think that brings up interesting questions of, well, what's the role of AI in policing? Is that AI effective or not? You know, I haven't seen any evidence that it's not effective, and I presume it's did its job in a somewhat okay manner because it's not very advanced. You know, it's just it's looking for words like cocaine and then bringing it up, right? But the fact is that law enforcement are using artificial intelligence programs in maybe targeted instances where we've seen Axon using it increasingly or recently for generating police reports. And now the FBI and its partners have been using AI in these massive surveillance operations. And there was kind of no debate about it, about how AI may or may not be used in policing. They kind of just went ahead and did it.
Yeah. As a very recent example, the Washington Post recently reported that cities that banned facial recognition surveillance, which sometimes relies on AI or very crude versions of it, but just pattern matching. Cities that banned it, San Francisco included, where I am, and Austin, those police departments worked around the ban by simply asking neighboring police departments to run the scans for them. Even when we ban it, look at that. Even the humble SFPD is finding ways to make things legal, much like the FBI has done with this entire program. So I wanted to ask kind of a long question here that ties back to, like you said, there was an assassination that did happen, that was carried out. And I want to keep that in mind as I ask this question, right? Which is that during this whole campaign of Anom, right, more phones are getting sold farther and farther into different companies. Features that it seems like appease the FBI are getting added. I think that voice scrambling feature is really funny because I think even if you remove the voice scrambling, how helpful is that for a prosecution? I don't know. Whatever, we'll let that stand. I just see that all of this is becoming bigger and bigger. It is ballooning. It is just becoming an enormous surveillance net. And yet, I think that is exactly what the FBI and the DOJ say they want from time to time in the United States. They want a backdoor into conversations that help them stop crimes. And so the big question here, that long preamble, is that Did Anom work? Like, did it work? If this is the thing that the FBI says it needs to stop crime, did Anom work, or did surveillance just grow? And I understand that both of those things can be true at the same time. But when we hear about, hey, an assassination did take place, even with backdoor communications, that feels like a pretty big criticism against the service. So, did Anom work? What happened?
I mean, it's an incredibly compelling question, and one that I genuinely think we're going to be wrestling with for a long time, myself included, and I've been completely obsessed with this story, and I hope, and now I just hope that other people can get obsessed with it as well, because if anything, for years, if not decades, the public has just had to sort of speculate, and I guess law enforcement as well, has had to speculate about what a backdoor in a tech product would actually look like. Well, here's the answer. This is literally what happens when there is a backdoor, and I find it crazy that not more people are paying attention to it, just because here's the answer. You can go look at it. And to drill down into the question a little bit more, yes, there was an assassination that was successfully planned on Anom. Everything from sourcing the weapon to tracking the target to celebrating about the murder afterwards and a bunch of ha-ha-ha-ha-ha-has sent across Anom. That was all done on the platform. And unfortunately, the FBI did not provide the messages to the Swedish authorities in time. The Swedish officials I spoke to, at least one of them said they could have prevented it if they got access to the messages earlier, but they stressed they did not blame the FBI because, if they got messages in May, maybe there'd be a murder in April or whatever, and I guess I understand that argument, but the fact is that a murder was planned on this. Now, to flip it, one person killed, very, very tragic. As I said, the FBI says it also saved or acted on 150 threats to life, which is, an order of magnitude obviously much higher than the one assassination. I'm obviously not trying to downplay that person's tragic death, but to put on a law enforcement hat for a second, maybe that is the calculus that these agents and officials are making, in the same way they were calculating, well, what crimes do we allow to happen and which ones do we clamp down on? As for the actual impact, I mean, beyond the 150 threats to life mitigated, tons upon tons of methamphetamine, amphetamine, cocaine, I think some MDMA seized, lots of weapons as well, hundreds of arrests on the day, and now well over 1,000 arrests. When you can join it with other investigations into Sky and EncroChat, the total number of arrests across Anom, Sky, EncroChat is 10,000 people were arrested. And they're all probably pretty big criminals. Obviously, I'm generalizing, but if you have a phone, you're generally a pretty serious criminal. And I'm comfortable saying that. So all of that impact there, a combination of backdoors and hacking operations, that sounds great. To put on my drug policy hat for a minute, the war on drugs continues. Tons of cocaine continues to go into Antwerp, massive upon massive stockpiles of drugs. And I was shocked that near the end of the book, again, one of the Swedish officials told me that even with these operations, the cocaine keeps coming. And she even asked, is this the right thing to do? Arresting these people, seizing these shipments, maybe there's another way. And I think that is basically another discussion. The book is very much more about the encryption debate rather than the drug policy one, but it absolutely has implications for that as well. So I think the FBI would say that Anom was successful based on those metrics, but it was also successful for probably a much, much, much more important reason. It showed that this was possible. It showed that they can backdoor a communications platform, and by and large, they pulled it off. And I think that sets the stage for what happens next, which is that criminals are not going to stop doing crime. The FBI is not going to stop doing FBI things. Yeah. And the criminals, at least some of the ones I've spoken to and the people who sell them tools, criminals have moved over to consumer apps such as Signal, at least some of them have. And the question is, what happens now? What happens when the criminals move to more consumer platforms where the rest of us are? Is the FBI going to follow as well?
I'm so glad you addressed so many of the things there, right? One assassination was planned, it was visible, and it was carried out. But at the same time, the FBI says it intervened on 150 threats to life, 10,000 arrests. And in the book, you get into pretty big detail about who these kinds of people are. There's no gray area, I would say, for a lot of these meth manufacturers. Like, there's no part of me that is like, well, is this guy that bad for creating several thousands tons of meth, on a weekly basis? Yeah, that's bad. Those are bad things. And again, you recognize that, well, if we put on the drug policy hat, well, the war on drugs continues. It didn't stop. And so I think framing the question as, did it work? Did it stop crime? Even as the person who asked that question, it is a little unfair, right? It doesn't, there is no stoppage of crime. But more importantly, I think you're absolutely right here. The FBI sees it as an enormous win. They proved they could do it. And to them, the consequences are not look at whose privacy was invaded to stop these drug lords. To them, the equation is the one person who did die, unfortunately. The math is so different for these government agencies. And so, it's a question I could talk about for the whole hour. And it was very difficult for me to not ask it at the beginning. So I'm just glad that there's so much thought going into this. I did want to close here on not how does the story all end, right? People can find that out. What was instead the most interesting thing you found out while you were reporting it? Because like I said, this book has so many pieces of, oh my goodness, what? And so I just wanted to ask your take on that to close it out here. What was the most surprising thing you learned during this?
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of people may know me for more of a privacy/surveillance reporter, but the truth is, I'm like a crime nerd. I love The Sopranos, man. I love The Wire as well, like Breaking Bad. I watch so many crime movies. It's like my, not even guilty pleasure. I'm very open about it. I just love crime films. And what surprised me, and probably the best thing for me personally, was when I got these tens of thousands of pages of police reports based on Anom, which was hundreds of thousands of Anom messages that I read over the course of months. It took me a very, very long time, and then translating them and figuring it all out. I was getting an unprecedented, for me, insight into how these criminals act. And on one hand, it's almost like how sterile it was. They treat it as a business. They're all professional, at least some were. And then on the other side, you'd have people who were complete clowns, who were just falling over themselves. And there's a really amazing scene where a drug trafficker called Microsoft that I really hope people read about in the book, but he's trying to smuggle hash and cucumbers, and then they're trying to get mini cucumbers, so after they've smuggled the hash, they can sell the vegetables, but the wrong size of cucumber arrives, so they can't sell the cucumbers, and it's just complete mess. And I'm this is something you would see on a TV show or something like that, or it would almost it would be too on the nose, but I'm reading these messages and they're real. They were intercepted by the FBI, and now they're in this PDF that I'm digging through. And it was just that sort of insane insight that I got into crime. And of course, law enforcement have got that insight as well. And I really did feel I guess I felt how the agents must have sensed when they were digging through all of these messages. And I felt the same. It's just these are crazy characters. And now I'm really invested in this one guy's arc, all of that sort of thing. Of course, I had the luxury of not having to worry about trying to save these people if they were then going to be, unfortunately, threatened. And for me, it was more journalistic and very entertaining. But it was just the sheer richness of the messages really blew me away.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And that exact kind of, the characters that emerge in the book, like you said, are so... They're bizarre, they're insane, they're unreal, and yet at the same time, they have the same outline of, I think you put it very well here, of clowns. They're just fools. They're just you can't believe that these people are real, and yet they absolutely are. The scenes and situations they get themselves into are honestly comedic. I did have actually one last tiny question before we go. You said you're a fan of crime films. What is your favorite crime film? And is it Goodfellas?
I'm afraid no. It's The Departed.
Oh, okay. That's good. That's a good one.
And I finally watched the film it's based on, Infernal. Affairs, I believe it's called, that Brad Pitt and some other people bought the rights to then make The Departed. Also a great film. And I mean, look, I can't really compare the book to The Departed. That would be absolutely stupid. Like, I can't, like, that's a masterclass in cinema. But I did want to have the two through lines of you have the cop side and you have the criminal side, and very similar to The Wire as well, right? And because I went to the FBI and I spoke to FBI agents involved, and because I spoke to criminals and I read all of their messages, I could do those two parallel lines, and that was just very, very satisfying to write.
Oh, yeah, that feels good. Oh, taking inspiration from like something you love and then putting that through line, like you said, in the thing you're making. That's so satisfying. Joseph, thank you again for coming on today's show. I want to tell listeners at home, Dark Wire is available this week, June 4th. You can find it. You can read it. I've been reading it. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. That is the highest praise I can give for a nonfiction book as a predominantly fiction enjoyer. So congrats, I guess. I don't know if I'm trying to congratulate you here, but I am saying I'm loving it. I'm riveted. I think it's great. It's better than the last nonfiction book I tried to read, which was about octopuses. Look, they're great, but I don't care. So, Joseph, thank you again for coming on today's show and for telling us all about Anom and the FBI.
Thank you so much.
To our listeners, we'll talk to you again in 2 weeks. Until then, stay tuned and stay safe. And remember, you can read all our cybersecurity coverage on Malwarebytes Labs at malwarebytes.com/blog. Finally, our intro music is by Kevin MacLeod from incompetech.com, and our outro music is by Wowo from un-.com. Today's show has been edited by our podcast consultant, Eric Johnson, at lightningpod.fm. Thank you, folks.